Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jana McElroy, a member of the Art Committee of the 19th Century Club, and we'd like to welcome you all to our program this afternoon. The mission of the 19th Century Club is strengthening our community through learning, giving, and sharing our landmark building. Okay, our speaker today, Margaret Farr, is an independent art historian with over 30 years of experience as an educator, editor, and evaluator. She has her PhD in art history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, specializing in 19th and 20th century art. For her master's thesis, she wrote a thesis titled Vincent van Gogh and the Mythology of the Modern Artist. For her PhD dissertation, she authored Impressionist Portraiture, a study in context and meaning. She was a former senior lecturer at the Art Institute and has recently taught Newberry Library, the University of Chicago's Graham School, and the Center for Life and Learning. She has published articles and book reviews on painting and photography of the 19th century, and she has taught at a number of colleges and universities. Please welcome Margaret Farr.
Thank you, Jenna. And I'm so delighted to be with you today. So let me get started. First of all, I just want to mention that that is not a prison photo. It was, in fact, a photograph taken by my dear friend and colleague, Annie Morse, who may have spoken to this group on more than one occasion, I don't know. But Annie is a splendid speaker, so if she hasn't been invited, she should be. But in any case, in the Architectural Fragments Gallery on the second floor of the Art Institute. So just to clear that up. So this talk is actually part of a series of talks that I've given on what I call American originals. Those artists who I believe emerge from this country who have made unique contributions that stem from the particular elements, the particular environment of the United States. And if we think about the way that a certain kind of depiction of nature in this country has been made, say, for example, the Hudson River School artists of the 19th century, like Thomas Cole or Frederick Church, artists of that nature, certainly Georgia O'Keeffe would be considered kind of in that vein, and yet her contributions are nevertheless so distinctive. She had a very personal rendition of nature, whereas their themes tended to be much more moralistic in that respect. So let's look today at her very modern versions of nature, and we'll go through her career in a chronological manner and see how she examined nature and would abstract from nature, and then also capture the perceptions of nature and its rhythms. At the same time, I also want to introduce to you the idea that we will have a wonderful opportunity this summer to see her depictions of New York in an exhibition that the Art Institute will be featuring called My New Yorks, opening on June 2nd. Georgia O'Keeffe was born in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin in 1887. She decided to become an artist when she was 12. From 1905 to 1906, she attended the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. But in 1907, she went to New York to study oil painting, pastel, and watercolor painting at the Art Students League there. She worked with William Merritt Chase and eventually won the Chase Still Life Scholarship. In 1908, she saw the first American exhibitions of the work of Auguste Rodin and Henri Matisse at the little galleries of the photo session known as 291, which was run by none other than Alfred Stieglitz, who was a photographer as well as a gallery owner, and who she was eventually to marry much later in 1924. Between 1908 and 1910, she worked as a freelance commercial artist, drawing such things as lace and embroidery advertisements in Chicago. Later, she attended a drawing class run by Alan Beament at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. Through him, she became interested in the anti-academic system of art education developed by Arthur Wesley Dow during the 1890s from Japanese principles of two-dimensional design. This system was saturated with symbolist notions of so-called visual music and synesthesia, which is when different senses intersect, such as one sense being associated with another, such as a sound, a shape, a color, a taste, or a smell. Hearing music and seeing colors, for example, is an example of synesthesia. For the next 6 years, O'Keeffe taught Dow's ideas at schools and colleges in Virginia, South Carolina, and Texas. Dow taught his students to capture the essence of reality and to look at details for inspiration, then simplify and abstract it. O'Keeffe clearly practiced this in her career. At the same time, she came to a revelation around 1915 that all of her works could be tied to one or another teacher's ideas, and she decided to largely free herself from these ideas and influences and to follow her own interests. For the most part, she did, except that these ideas of Dow's really did linger. But I wanted to point out with these works that certainly in the one on the right, you see the influence of Georges Seurat and pointillism, and on the left, certainly of kind of a general plein air painting of the kind that the Impressionists practiced. And then here, this wonderful quote, I found that I could say things with colors and shapes that I couldn't say in any other way, things that I had no words for. O'Keeffe was intrigued with an idea that one of her instructors had shared with her, namely the notion of filling a space in a beautiful way. This idea could also be expanded beyond art to how you organize your living space or even how you dress. Certainly, she embraced this idea in her work and in her life. O'Keeffe returned to New York in autumn 1914 to work for 6 months with Dow at the Teachers College at Columbia University. She became increasingly aware of European modernism, seeing work by Picasso, Braque, and Francis Picabia at the gallery titled 291. It was basically an abbreviated name of the address, which was 291 Fifth Avenue. By summer 1915, she had read twice in translation Kandinsky's famous book on the spiritual in art, as well as Cubism and Post-Impressionism by a man named Arthur Jerome Eddy, who was a Chicagoan and collector as well as a lawyer. He was actually something of a Renaissance man, as well as issues of the magazine's Camera Work and 291, which were both published by Stieglitz. In late 1915, she produced a breakthrough series of large charcoal abstractions, two of which you see here, from, as she said, the things in my head. Each of these drawings contains concrete, if unconscious, references to the plant and wave motifs of Art Nouveau. The organic geometries of this series, you can see things like ovoids, ellipses, vertical stalks, spirals, seed pods, tendrils, arabesques. Things like this can also be seen in many of her later works, in her paintings. But you see them here in very early forms. Stieglitz saw the series in January 1916, always in search of the new and determined to recognize and foster an indigenous American art. He exhibited these drawings at 291 from May to July in 1916. So if you look at the one on the left, for example, just kind of breaking down that drawing, you can see to the right-hand side of that drawing on the left, there's these kind of wonderful waving forms. You know, is it meant to be a flowing river or something of that nature? In the center, you see these bulbous forms. Are they stylized trees? Are they seed pods? And then you see the jagged form off to the left. Is it a bolt of lightning? Is it meant to be mountains? So, it's as if she's looked at nature and kind of abstracted elements from nature. And then, the kind of sweeping form you see in the image on the right, that too seems to derive from nature and yet not precisely describe any one particular element in nature. Nearly 24 years his junior and just gaining recognition as a painter, O'Keeffe made an immediate impact on Stieglitz, both artistically and emotionally. The two began an avid, often daily correspondence that eventually turned into a passionate affair, and they finally married in 1924. O'Keeffe created her first sculpture, also titled Abstraction, in 1916 to commemorate the passing of her mother. This is an abstraction of a standing figure with kind of head bent forward, but it also has formal similarities to the sweeping natural forms of the charcoal drawings we were just looking at. Now, she was teaching in Texas. Oh, sorry, I just wanted to mention briefly that Stieglitz was really trying to foster an American modernism at this time, and he had an entire stable of young artists whom he supported, and from left to right, so at upper left, that's Arthur Dove. And notice how the forms in that Dove painting are very similar to the O'Keeffe in the lower right. And then in the lower left, that's Marsden Hartley. The Dove and the Hartley are both in the Art Institute. That's John Marin in the center, and Max Weber in the upper right. So all of these artists were promoted and exhibited by Stieglitz. And O'Keeffe becomes part of this. I was doing a class on a seminar at the Newberry on O'Keeffe and Stieglitz on one occasion, and one of the members of the class said, "Where would O'Keeffe have been if Stieglitz hadn't promoted her?" I thought it was an excellent question. because indeed he did promote her. So, it's a really good question. So she was teaching in Texas, and she was really struck by, of course, the broad plains there. And certainly the evening star was a motif that intrigued her. The one on the left is one of 8 watercolors on this theme. Although she lived there only a short time, the landscape of West Texas inspired her work and impacted the development of her style. In a letter to a fellow artist, she wrote of her struggle to capture the landscape's mellow-looking dry grass and the quiet grandeur of the region. The colorful sunrises and sunsets inspired her to experiment with the psychic effects of color, and that too was also related to her readings of Kandinsky, who was also very interested in the psychic effects of color. By the way, these are very small. Both of these are about 9 by 11 inches. And the one on the right captures the light coming on the plains, which was an effect, a morning effect that she captured when she was, she said, I remember one morning I got up very early to catch a bus from Amarillo back to Canyon, which is where she was teaching. And we saw the most extraordinary sunrise. When I got back to Canyon, I thought maybe that was something I could paint. It was really what started me painting again. I worked in watercolor, but because I never had time for oils, because, of course, oil paints take a while to dry. So, so you can imagine this young artist working quickly with these materials. Now, in 1918, Stieglitz invited O'Keeffe to return to New York from Texas in order to pursue her career, promising his financial support. Long unhappy in his marriage, he separated from his wife and began living with O'Keeffe. And as I said earlier, they eventually married in 1924 after his divorce. O'Keeffe provided the inspiration for an important group of Stieglitz's mature photographs, which I'll show you shortly, because he made many photographs of her over a 20-year period. For many vanguard artists in the early 20th century, music offered a model for expressing nonverbal emotional states and sensations. O'Keeffe was fascinated by what she called the idea that music could be translated into something for the eye. But her references to music in the titles of her paintings derived equally from her belief that visual art, like music, could convey powerful emotions independent of representational subject matter. In Music, Pink and Blue, on the left, the swelling, undulating forms imply a connection between the visual and the aural, that's A-U-R-A-L, while also suggesting the rhythms and harmonies that O'Keeffe perceived in nature. So again, Kandinsky is very important here. And in the Art Institute's picture, Blue and Green Music on the right, again, those of you who are very conversant with music probably have a better language to explain it than I do. It is, there's something about the way that you have a strong diagonal, darker diagonal form, to me seems almost like the blaring of a horn, and then the blue and green forms that open out from that seem like softer oral elements that accompany that. But there are also other paintings in which you have swelling, modulated forms, and then something more architectonic, like, again, that darker form in the center. One of the things that's kind of intriguing about O'Keeffe is that she could do both soft and hard at the same time. And there are these, as I say, these architectonic elements. So here are some of the photographs that Stieglitz made of O'Keeffe. And to me, some of these are somewhat problematic. I mean, there are over 300 of these photographs. So clearly, he did not, it's interesting. It's almost as if it's like a kaleidoscopic view of her. He clearly saw her not in one format, not in one way. Some of them are nude, some of them are clothed, some of them are show just her feet or her hands. Some of them are just torsos. Some of them show her works in the background. And he exhibited these. And I do wonder just how problematic it was for her as an artist, for especially in the nude pictures, to be shown as she was trying to forge her own career. So I do wonder. Even as, at the same time, her works were being interpreted as being very sexualized, the flower paintings in particular. So it's intriguing to me. Now, she always claimed that she was a collaborator in these pictures. Now, as I mentioned to you, the exhibition at the Art Institute, while it's going to be apparently largely based on the urban pictures, and I'll show you some of those shortly, there also were pictures that were made at Lake George. There was a summer home. In the late 1880s, Stieglitz's father bought a large property on Lake George in upstate New York, which was a popular resort area for upper-class New Yorkers, while Stieglitz's parents and siblings spent their summers at the lakeside villa. Stieglitz and O'Keeffe stayed at the farmhouse on the estate. And the little building that you see on the right was O'Keeffe's painting studio. And so the one on the left that you see is one of a series of cloud studies that Stieglitz did called Equivalence. He got very interested in these, and I wanted to show you these because there's an interesting, there was a wonderful film that was made about O'Keeffe in the 1970s. And in that film, she said, I was very, very interested in what he was doing, and he was very, very interested in what I was doing artistically. And you'll see that because there are wonderful correspondences at points between their work. And you can see that in these cloud studies. So in any case, what you see in the work on the right, My Shanty, is this very kind of, it seems very non-O'Keeffe-like. It's very subdued in color. And it shows this building that is very simplified. Now, this is one of 3 works that Duncan Phillips, yes, that's the Phillips of the Phillips collection, had on approval in 1926. The other 2 were returned to Stieglitz. Phillips was drawn to this painting for its atmosphere of portentous solitude and it's stark expression of a somber Celtic mood. I don't know what that means exactly. A characterization that O'Keeffe later discounted. As she recalled, she had painted My Shanty in response to the criticism of the men in Stieglitz's circle: Arthur Dove, John Marin, Charles Demuth, and Marsden Hartley, and the photographer Paul Strand. In an effort to satisfy them, O'Keeffe abandoned her vision of painting in clean and clear colors and adopted their dreary color scheme. Only after doing so did the men approve of her work and recognize her ability as a painter. So, just goes to show. But see, I mean, there is an interesting correspondence between what they're doing. Stieglitz on the right, O'Keeffe on the left. And again, Stieglitz on the left, O'Keeffe on the right. O'Keeffe on the right, Stieglitz left and center. And then we have, all these are O'Keeffe's. She gets very interested in photography and the aesthetics of photography. This is a direct result of posing so often for Stieglitz's camera. She also knew and valued the work of other important photographers associated with 291, especially Edward Steichen, Paul Strand, and Charles Sheeler. Beginning in 1919, she started to isolate certain elements from the photographic process to serve a new goal: objectivity. These included cropped images, isolated detail, magnified close-up, and the lens malfunctions common to old view cameras, such as convergence, halation, and flare. She used them for abstraction and expressive purposes. So you can see, obviously, these, deep close-ups. And you can see on the right, Imogen Cunningham's, an example of her close-up photography on the right. But it's also for the one on the left, there's just so much gradation of tone that she was able to achieve. It's just remarkable. I mean, she just had such a nuanced sense of color. And her modulations of color. And even when she's dealing with more subdued colors, as in the center image, nevertheless, she is able to achieve such a range that it's really quite remarkable. So the one in the center is one of her early masterpieces. Enlarging the petals far beyond life-size proportions, she forces the viewer to observe the small details that might otherwise be overlooked. When the paintings from this group were first shown in 1924, even Stieglitz was shocked by their audacity. Because they're good size. I mean, the one in the center is 3 by 2.5 feet. And here are some of the New York paintings. The one on the far right is by Charles Sheeler, who was another member of the Stieglitz group. And someone who has been described as a precisionist. That's a kind of splinter group, if you will. The precisionists were known for their interest in both urban and industrial architecture, rendered in a very clean, crisp, linear style. Sometimes, especially for her urban works, O'Keeffe is considered to be in that group, but, only for those works. So you see, I should explain that they marry, so O'Keeffe and Stieglitz marry in 1924. They moved into the Shelton Hotel, which was the tallest residential building in the world at that time in New York City. And they lived on, I think, the 30th floor. And she made paintings from that floor and also from the street level. So the one on the left and the one to the right of that are, so the two left-hand paintings are of the Shelton. The one to the right of that is the Radiator Building. And the one to the far right, as I mentioned, is Sheeler. So the second one from the left is in the Art Institute's collection. And this is what she said about this work. She said, I went out one morning to look at the Shelton Hotel, and there was the optical illusion of a bite out of one side of the tower made by the sun, with sunspots against the building and against the sky. And that's what inspired her to paint this way, with that big, bite, as she said, taken out of it. But actually, that is an optical illusion that was created by this phenomenon that is known as lens flare, which, to the best of my understanding, is something that was common to the lenses of that time, or rather the peculiarity of lenses at that time. Also the sunspots. So I don't have a pointer, but in any case, you can see the sunspots in that image. And that fascinated her, and all those optical elements contributed to a very lively painting. So I think the other thing that is intriguing about that work that's not true of the image to the far left is that it really animates that picture. And you get the element of nature juxtaposed against this man-made building, so that you get the awesomeness of the, if I can put it that way, there's a kind of urban sublime about these skyscrapers, right? But then there's also the awesome quality of nature, which creates these effects. So those two things are juxtaposed. And then you also see the wavy aspects of the steam that's rising from the streets. And, it's a really quite animated picture. So expect more of the same in the exhibition. And then, again, another Lake George image, and I'm comparing it on the right with, this is, in this instance, it's a Charles Demuth image, another one of these precisionist artists, and it's a bit of industrial architecture. Certainly we don't have industrial architecture. This is, in fact, just the just some domestic architecture in the case of the O'Keeffe painting and the Stieglitz photograph. So you have, one of the things, this is one of my favorite O'Keeffe paintings. I know you probably are thinking I'm quite strange, but it's an interesting kind of perceptual puzzle, and I think that's what intrigues me. And it's also a little offbeat for her. But you see in the center what the window actually looks like. And in the O'Keeffe painting, notice how she's playing around with us and kind of messing around with our optical senses here, or perceptual senses. It almost looks like you have a screen door into a space, but actually you have the window structure, flanking shutters, and that little pediment. and then you are looking into that space, and you realize it's ultimately that rectangle is probably a doorway in the interior, but initially it looks like it's a window, right? So it's kind of interesting and playful image. But getting back to the flowers, because we have so many of them. In her youth, she had been particularly struck by the jack-in-the-pulpit plant. In 1930, she executed a series of 6 paintings of this flowering plant at Lake George in New York. The National Gallery of Art in Washington is home to 5 of these 6 works, and so I'm showing you 3 of these. The plant in kind of its glory, if you will, on the left, and then notice how she kind of zooms in, and you can kind of understand how people would read a certain sexualized interpretation for some of these. But she, as I said, the teachings of Dow, Arthur Wesley Dow, they did make an imprint on her. She did abstract from nature, and she renders them on a large scale. The scale of these is 3.5 by 2.5 feet, 4 by 2.5 feet, and 3 by 1.5 feet. So she starts to become associated with these with flowers on a grand scale. And she's making us look at them very closely. In the same way, she starts getting us to look at things out west very closely. In 1929, she starts spending summers in New Mexico. And there she sees these crosses. She said, "I saw the crosses so often, and often in unexpected places, like a thin, dark veil of the Catholic Church spread over the New Mexico landscape." This was after her first visit to Taos, New Mexico, in the summer of 1929. So she would go out on these late-night walks in the desert, and these were probably crosses erected near remote chapels by the Catholic lay brotherhoods called the Penitentes. And they were nailed together with these, boy, it's hard to make out. Anyway, if you can see the little circles, they were nailed together with wooden pegs. And notice how they've got gray hills. Well, she described them as being like the hills that go on and on was like looking at 2 miles of gray elephants. I like the way she described that. So anyway, it was a completely different experience for her, looking at the landscape out there. Everything fascinated her because it was so different from the Middle West, where she grew up, and of course, certainly from the Lake George area. In 1930, she witnessed a drought in the Southwest that caused the starvation of many animals whose skeletons littered the landscape. She was fascinated by these bones and shipped a number back to New York so she could paint them. She noted, "To me, they are as beautiful as anything I know. The bones seem to cut sharply to the center of something that is keenly alive in the desert, even though it is vast and empty and untouchable." So the Art Institute's painting is on the left. She bought these calico roses. Apparently people used to put them on graves, as a decoration. She found them kind of both amusing but also interesting to paint. And so even though this is a kind of a severe image in certain respects, She found the skulls really beautiful and not having to do with death at all, but intriguing visually and having to do with life, kind of paradoxically. For the one on the right, she said that at the time she painted this, she recalled that all the men in her circle, artists, Stieglitz's circle essentially, were talking about the great American novel and the great American this and that. And so she decided to paint the red stripes on either side, and she had already been painting a blue background for it, and she added the white. And so she figured this was the great American painting. So she said it amused her. She didn't know if anybody else got it. And this is Jimson Weed White Flower number 1. I have a wonderful quote about this. Now this is quite large. This is over 4.5 by 4 feet. And so think about that. You're standing in front of it. It's big. You're small. And one early critic observed that confronting an O'Keeffe flower painting made the viewer feel small, quote, as if we humans were butterflies. Yeah, exactly. Changing our orientation to the painting. O'Keeffe spent some time in Hawaii as part of a commission from the Hawaiian Pineapple Company, as it was called then. She was offered an all-expenses-paid trip there in 1939, though the artist only spent 9 weeks visiting the island Paradise, tasked with making 2 ads for Dole pineapples. She completed about 20 paintings. Dole's offer had also come at precisely the right time. She was 51 years old. She was living full-time in New Mexico, while Stieglitz remained in New York. He had an ongoing affair with a woman named Dorothy Norman, which weighed heavily on O'Keeffe. Both of them had affairs, but this was kind of an ongoing affair, and she didn't handle that well. And equally troubling was an increasingly lackluster response to her work. Critics had begun to decry her emphasis on desert landscapes and motifs as nothing more than a kind of mass production. She visited Maui, Oahu, Hawaii, and Kauai, painting the island's dramatic gorges, waterfalls, and tropical flowers. Among them, this one, hibiscus with plumeria, pink and yellow petals towering against a clear blue sky transformed the delicate blossoms into a joyous monumentality. But of the 20 canvases of Hawaii she completed, none showed a pineapple. Only after Dole had flown from New York, or flown to New York, did she finally, if reluctantly, paint the desired fruit. So an example of what she did paint, what she did turn in, is on the right. And they're like, no, that's a competition. That's not what we want. So, okay, so they sent her the fruit, and so she could finish the assignment. It's a beautiful plant, she told Time later. It's made up of long green blades, and the pineapples grow on top of it. I never knew that. The resulting painting appeared in advertisements in both Vogue and the Saturday Evening Post. What O'Keeffe might have been surprised to learn, however, was that none of the flowers she painted were actually native to Hawaii. Pineapple, hibiscus, bougainvillea, plumeria, and many of the other plants that we typically associate with the Hawaiian Islands were actually brought there by other peoples. O'Keeffe was also strongly interested in the Western landscape. In 1940, she purchased a house at Ghost Ranch in the Chama River Valley of New Mexico. She spent her summers and falls at Ghost Ranch, where she painted the breathtaking views, including, on the left, these immense red, pink, and yellow striated cliffs that rose up 700 feet behind her house. Dotted with green shrubs, the landscape faithfully reproduces the vibrant colors of the American Southwest. The immensity of these geologic outcroppings are emphasized in the tiny patch of blue sky at the top left. I mean, very tiny. Awed up by these colorful cliffs, O'Keeffe painted them 7 times. On the right, the black place was O'Keeffe's name for one of her favorite locations to paint, discovered as she toured New Mexico in her Model A Ford. Located in the Beastie Badlands about 150 miles from Ghost Ranch, the Dude Ranch north of Abiquiu, where O'Keeffe lived in the summer, the black place featured a landscape of numerous black and gray hills. And this is where she referred to them as seeming like a mile of elephants, gray hills, all about the same size with almost white sand at their feet. And more bones. Whereas earlier she had, the one on the left is from the 30s, summer days, with that juxtaposition of the bones and the flowers. So that was the 1930s, that's 1936. But in the 40s, the one on the right is 1944, she starts looking through the bones, what the writer Jean Toomer describes as the universe through the portal of a bone. I love that, and it's interesting too, the notion that she's kind of thinking about the positive and negative, but it's intriguing. It's not really negative because the sky becomes something solid, something very durable, not something empty as you perceive it. And then she also starts to switch out the colors, as you can see here, becomes very expressionistic. And then there's a photograph of her with the painting. It's interesting. She's, all the things she's, you think about all the things she eliminates from this picture. Any extraneous detail is left out, and it's just the bone. Now, Ghost Ranch was fine, except it was not someplace you could stay year-round. So in 1945, she purchased, and with the help of her friend Marie Chabot, began to restore a 5,000 square foot ruined colonial residential compound in the small hilltop town of Abiquiu, New Mexico. She would own the property until her death in 1986, and its spaces and vistas inspired many of her paintings, including several depictions of the enclosed adobe patio at the heart of the complex. It was attractive to her for both practical and aesthetic reasons. It was 50 miles north of Santa Fe and 60 miles west of the bustling artist colony of Taos, offering peace and solitude, qualities O'Keeffe felt that she needed in order to paint. It also was situated a short distance from Ghost Ranch, And she had spent a part of almost every year at Ghost Ranch, beginning in 1936. But of course, as I said, it was not weatherproofed to be habitable during the winter months. So, and 1945, she buys this. 1946, Stieglitz dies. So this was a very good purchase for her because eventually she was to move there full time. She said, when I first saw the Abiquiu house, it was a ruin with an adobe wall around a garden broken in a couple of places by falling trees. As I climbed and walked about the room, I found a patio with a very pretty well house and bucket to draw up water. It was a good-sized patio with a long wall with a door on one side. The wall with a door in it was something I had to have. It took me 10 years to get it. 3 more years to fix up the house so I could live in it, and after that, the wall with a door was painted many times. So that's what you see here, and she was fascinated by this. And you see a kind of interesting oblique view on the far left. And in the image on the far left, can you see how in the bottom left-hand corner of that, it looks like there are some receding squares? Those are tiles. And there was also a kind of built-in bench, which is probably very hard to make out here. But in any case, there, and in the center image, you can see that she paints the door different colors at different times. And then just for the heck of it, I included a Mark Rothko painting because that was going on at the same time, right? I mean, so, she's very much in the spirit of the times with these very almost severe images of this, plain patio. And then she also did a series on this cottonwood tree. And just to show you that, she was always kind of searching out these themes, and kind of in the manner of Claude Monet. She goes after this tree in different seasons, different times of day, and it also put me in mind of Piet Mondrian, because you see this kind of almost like a scaffolding of this tree in its abstract elements, where things are suggested, they're not delineated. And ultimately, she's giving us the essence of the Southwest rather than giving us a botanical lesson. And then, of course, towards the end of her career, she gets fascinated by she does a lot of traveling. She travels to the Far East, she travels to India, she travels to Europe, the Middle East, and flying in airplanes inspired her last 2 major series, the aerial views of rivers and expanses of sky. So here we see the expanses of sky. Of course, the Art Institute's great Sky Above Clouds 4, which is the largest of the series, certainly, and was painted over the course of a summer into early fall, and was also painted from top to bottom, and she also had to have help stretching that canvas because she was in her 70s, I think, when she made it. And, but here are some of the other ones. And of course, this way before Boeing, of course, had their problems, but she said that I was flying out from the big city and the sky looked like you could just go out the door of the plane and walk right out to the horizon. The clouds looked so solid. Well, I couldn't wait to get back to paint it. But again, look at the one at the upper right. Doesn't that look like something a color field painter would produce? And then she did a series of aerial views of rivers. And they're wonderful. I mean, this reminds me of some things that Bryce Marden painted with that kind of calligraphic stroke. And then she only produced, I think, 3 sculptures over the course of her career. And this one was, produced, was actually done in clay in 1946, but she did not cast it in bronze until 1979 to 80, when she produced small editions using a variety of materials such as bronze and cast aluminum in 3 sizes: 10 inches, which you see on the left, 36 inches, and 10 feet. I know, can you imagine? And the one on the left is from an edition of 10. But look how nicely it corresponds to works from earlier in her career. And by the way, the one on the right is from the Art Institute's collection. It's a lovely pastel, which is only out once in a blue moon because it's a work on paper. But you know, it's there. She said once, I see shapes. You know, they're like things in her head. And the Nautilus clearly was something that appears to her on more than one occasion. Okay, now we're almost at the end here. Now, in the early 1970s, Juan Hamilton came to see O'Keeffe asking if she had any work for him. Initially saying no and protective of her privacy, he waited for a while and came back later. She asked him if he knew anything about packing a shipping crate. Over time, they became friends, and he taught her how to make ceramics. So that was what she did. That was her last bit of creative work, because her eyesight failed in the 1970s, leading her to eventually give up painting. So she later turned to ceramics, since the impulse to create was still strong in her. So, and she died in 1986 when she was 98 years old. Now, I had to say that the Juan Hamilton connection was somewhat controversial because when she died, she left him both of her dwellings, Ghost Ranch and the one at Abiquiu, and most of her $70 million estate. So her relatives, as you can imagine, had a thing or two to say about that. However, we won't dwell on that. I'll just mention that why is she an American original? I think she is because of the timeless quality to her works, because of the element of the sublime. I think that her works lift us out of time and place, and her works, the scale of the works, not that they're all large, but they think about what the scale does to the viewer. And also, there's an emphasis on close looking. She brings us into those works. And she makes us think about the nature of beauty. And that's not something that we find too often in contemporary art, certainly. So I hope that you have enjoyed this look at her works today, and I thank you for joining me today.
Yes, we have time for a couple of questions, if anybody has any.
Thank you, Margaret. Wonderful, as usual. I wonder if you could tell us who some of the other American originals are, in your opinion.
You know, you were in the class. So Thomas Cole. Well, okay, my mind is filled with the ones that I want to do this fall. Archibald Motley. Do you know Archibald Motley? Yes. Okay. We talked about Faith Ringgold, who just died. And, all right, I'll tell you some that I'm thinking of for the future. Certainly Winslow Homer, Edward Hopper, Richard Serra, who just died. Like him or hate him, I think he's an original. Carrie James Marshall.
Any other questions?
I'm just curious to know the story behind the Art Institute acquiring the giant clouds painting.
Oh, that's such a good story. Well, it traveled here as part of an exhibition. I want to say this was in the 1970s. It was a traveling exhibition, and the next stop, I think it was 3 stops. One was New York, one was Chicago. The third stop was to be the old SF MoMA. The old SF MoMA did not have a entryway big enough for the painting. So it stayed at the Art Institute for a long time. Eventually, it was a combination of a donor and maybe it's not the O'Keeffe Foundation. I don't think there is such a thing. But there was something related to O'Keeffe's family or something. But it was a dual entity that was responsible for it. But a donor was definitely part of it. It probably says on the label, next time you're at the Art Institute, how it got in, or on the website.
I'd like to thank her for a very interesting and informative talk.